When the disciples set out on the road to Caesarea Philippi that day, none of them likely expected Jesus to call Peter Satan. They might have imagined the conversation in a variety of ways. Maybe they would be reflecting on one of the recent miracles, the signs, the wonders that Jesus had performed, feeding of 4,000, or perhaps just earlier, the healing of the blind man in Bethsaida. Yeah, we know it took 2 tries, but he got healed before it was over, right? They could have considered any sort of conversation topic, but it's very unlikely that they expected the chief among them, Peter, to be compared to the devil himself. This unlikely, unexpected conflict really creates something of a turning point in the Gospel of Mark. Up until this point, the disciples have succeeded and failed at other times. They've done okay. They're not shining like star students. Sometimes they get things wrong. Sometimes Jesus gives them a gentle rebuke or corrects them. Don't you still understand? But at this point, with this stunning rebuke, things take a downward turn for the disciples. From this point forward, they are portrayed in an increasingly negative light. They used to be able to heal people. Now, later in verse 9, they're not going to be able to do that. They used to be able to cast out demons. Coming up in chapter 9, they're going to try to cast out a demon, but they'll fail. They will be found arguing over which one among their number is the greatest. They'll see some other guy who's not part of their group casting out demons, and they'll put a stop to it. Because if they're not doing the ministry, nobody is. We'll find a couple of them asking Jesus, "Can we sit at your left and right hand?" From this point forward, it's all downhill for the disciples. They are seeming to descend into a darker and darker experience. The thing that begins to come clear, especially in the debate about who's the greatest and who gets to sit at the left and right hand of Jesus, is that their loyalty is not ultimately offered to Jesus, but to themselves. Their loyalty is with number one. They're with Jesus, but they're with him for what they can get from him. And that posture of disloyalty leads to this turning point. Perhaps it's even a breaking point, where the things that were there that they didn't realize were there are being exposed. And Jesus is raising questions and offering a rebuke that reveals what the real problem was. And the real problem turns out to be a posture of disloyalty, a withholding of their allegiance. Mark wants us to realize something essential to discipleship. The disciples have to figure this out and embrace it, and all disciples have to figure it out and embrace it. And it has to do with that question of loyalty and who our loyalty is offered to. And it has to do with the reality that if our loyalty is aimed in the wrong direction, then something's got to be reoriented. Something has to transfer. And so Mark offers us this narrative, this account of Jesus and Peter and the others, to help us discover that we must embrace what they had to embrace, the reality that discipleship requires the transfer of loyalty from myself to the Lord. Discipleship, following Jesus, requires a transfer of loyalty, a transfer of allegiance. We come into the world offering our allegiance to ourselves. Jesus comes into the world and requires his followers transfer that allegiance to him. Now, for that to become thoroughly clear and for the implications of it to be clear to us, we need some context. The disciples are with Jesus on the road from Bethsaida to Caesarea Philippi. It's not a short walk. And Jesus takes the time to raise some questions. And you've probably picked up that when Jesus starts raising questions, the questions typically have an agenda. They're going somewhere. He's raising questions because he wants to teach something. He doesn't just offer the lecture, he raises the questions and invites the disciples to consider the answers and to engage. And so the first question he raises is simple, straightforward. Hey, what do you guys hear out there? What are people saying? Who do people say I am? And the answer comes back. Well, some people think you're John the Baptist or someone like him. Others think you're Elijah or someone like him. One of the prophets, these powerful, bold, courageous men from the history of Israel who would speak into the sin of the people and offer a word of exhortation, comfort, a word from God. People think you're like that, Jesus. Jesus says, that's good. Here's another question. Who do you say I am? And notice the answer isn't one of the prophets. Because they're discovering, yes, Jesus is like the prophets, but he's more than that. Peter jumps up. No surprise there. He's frequently the first one to jump up. You're the Messiah. Some of your translations may say, you're the Christ. Same thing, different languages. Christ comes through the Greek. Messiah comes through the Hebrew. In both instances, it refers to the King, the one who will save the people of God from all of the bad guys out there who want to make them slaves in their own land and take their liberty, their freedom, their money and taxes, their crops to feed soldiers, all the things that they take. Peter has in mind someone like Judas Maccabeus, who 160 or so years before Jesus was born, rode into Jerusalem, killed the oppressors, cleansed the temple, and freed Israel. When you have a first century Jew talking Messiah language, that's the image they have in mind. Jesus, however, has a different image in mind. He knows what Peter's thinking, but he's got to reorient Peter's perspective on what it means to be the Messiah. And so he teaches. Yes, that's right. Don't tell anyone. We get kind of caught up over the frequency with which Jesus tells them to keep things quiet. After all, aren't we supposed to share the gospel and tell our neighbors about Jesus? Well, knowing what we know now about people like Judas Maccabeus, 160 or so years before Jesus was born, if you're running a kingdom movement, that's one thing. If that kingdom movement develops into a messianic movement that typically involves one guy thinking he's in charge of everything, well, you can imagine how dangerous that would be. So let's not mention this Messiah thing to the Pharisees or the Herodians or the Sadducees or the temple authorities, because they're going to see it as a challenge to their power and try to put a stop to it. Jesus says, keep it quiet. Let's talk about what it means. And he began to teach them. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, He must be killed and after 3 days rise again. And Mark tells us he spoke plainly about this. It wasn't confusing. Lots of the things he says are confusing, if you remember. He would tell parables and the disciples would bring him into the house and say, "Would you explain that, please?" It wasn't clear. "Put it to us plainly, Jesus." And he would explain the parables privately with the disciples. Mark tells us here, no parables. This isn't a figurative story. Jesus is shooting straight with them. He's telling them plainly what has to happen. And notice how his account of what it means to be the Messiah is radically different from what we said Peter and the others would have assumed about what it means to be the Messiah. Peter assumes the Messiah is going to kill people. That's what you do. If someone like the Roman Empire has taken over Jerusalem, a Messiah is the guy who's going to get an army together, ride into town with sword and spear, and kill the bad guys. There have been people who thought they were the Messiah, got their posse together, rode into town with sword and spear, and wound up dead. But that just means they're not the Messiah. It's pretty straightforward. A dead Messiah ain't the Messiah. And now Jesus is saying, yes, you're right. Here's what it means. I'll be killed. Does it make more sense now why Peter rebukes Jesus? Takes him aside. Jesus, come on, let's talk. Everybody knows Messiahs don't get killed. A dead Messiah ain't a Messiah. What we'll do is get our swords. And you can see where it's going. This is why Peter brings a sword when the confrontation happens. He's expecting a battle. This is why he chops off that guy's ear. He's expecting to fight. That's what Maccabeus did. That's what we've got to do. And so he has the gall to rebuke Jesus, the one moments before he had confessed as Messiah King. Who has Peter's loyalty? Now Jesus rebukes Peter. And he uses some of the strongest language in the entire gospel. Get behind me, Satan. Now, this isn't the first time we've heard about Satan in the Gospel of Mark. First time was in chapter 1. Mark doesn't tell us as much about Jesus' time of temptation in the wilderness, but he does tell us Jesus went into the wilderness, that he was tempted, and that he was tempted by Satan. Then he moves on to the next thing. Mark doesn't waste words. But here we have Peter being compared to the tempter. And Jesus offers no gentle correction. This isn't gentle Jesus, meek and mild. He's rebuked the disciples before in the boat after the feeding of the 4,000. Don't you yet understand? This is next level rebuke, though, isn't it? Get behind me, Satan. Your concerns don't match the concerns of God. It sounds like Jesus is really tempted here. It's one thing when the devil tempts you to betray God. It's another thing when your best friend does it. It's probably a lot easier to resist temptation when it's the devil. It's a lot harder when it's someone you've trusted. And so here's Jesus, in some ways anticipating the prayer he'll pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. If there's a way for this cup of suffering to pass from me, let it pass. And here's his best friend saying, you don't have to suffer. We'll kill him. Get behind me, Satan. And the critique isn't just you need a better education. Sometimes we kind of think that's what's going on here because our translations struggle to render this text. Sometimes it's like the NIV 2011, your concerns don't match the concerns of God. Other times it's you're thinking human thoughts, not God's thoughts. And it's that idea of concern or thinking and mindfulness. And the Greek word is phroneo, which often is translated as mind, have the mind of Christ. We've talked about that before, same word. But it's not just cognition here. It's not just, hey, you need to learn some stuff. You need some synaptic connections. It's not just a brain function that Peter needs. Jesus is diagnosing the reality that the whole posture of his being, his entire self, is oriented away from God. The concerns that you have are not the concerns that God has. The posture that you're taking is not oriented towards the things of God. The posture that you're taking, Peter, is oriented away. It's in contrast with the things of God. The posture you are taking, Peter, represents disloyalty to the kingdom and to the one you've named the Messiah. So Jesus, as he does, takes the opportunity to teach. And you can kind of feel everything come down a notch or two. He calls the crowd together along with his disciples and begins to teach them. This is one of the reasons Mark just told us about the blind guy that needed to be touched twice to be healed. Remember the story? We just read it last week. Jesus goes up to the blind man, spits, as he does, touches the guy's face. Can you see? And you remember what he said? Kind of. I see people, but they're fuzzy. They look like trees walking around. So Jesus touches him again. Can you see? Oh, yes. Now I see clearly. That man's journey to wholeness, his journey to sight, was a process. It didn't all happen in one fell swoop. It took time. Peter and the others have seen a little bit. They see that Jesus is the Messiah. Still fuzzy what that means, though. It's not clear to them. If the blind man needed to be touched twice, so do these disciples. So Jesus says, let's keep going. He called the crowd along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Whoever wants to be my disciples. This is our stuff, disciples. We talk about the Great Commission, disciple the nations. We talk about discipleship processes and discipleship groups. We talk about discipleship ministers. We have the language of discipleship permeating everything that we do together. We call people to be disciples. We want to grow disciples. Disciples, disciples, disciples. What does Jesus say about just being a disciple? He says, if anyone, not just the Peter, not just the 12, not just the crowd, if anyone wants to be my disciple, my follower, the first thing that has to happen is self-denial. Peter, that loyalty to yourself that you carry has got to be reoriented. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. That commandment, that description of discipleship represents a shift in loyalty, doesn't it? You begin this process loyal to whom? Right here. Number one. Jesus says, if you want to be my follower, that self-loyalty must be transferred to me. And that looks like taking up a cross. Now, if Jesus had an HR manager, they'd probably been having fits right now. Excuse me, not HR, PR. Let's get the relations right. Public relations and marketing. And we know this because a lot of times when we talk about the gospel, we don't talk about it like this. Jesus loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. And if you give your life to him, everything will be great. Your worries will go away. Your fortune will increase. You'll have favor. Things will be swell. Notice when we talk about the gospel like that, whose loyalties are we appealing to? It'll be good for you. And if you're loyal to yourself, won't you make decisions that are good for you? When Jesus talks about discipleship responding to the gospel of the kingdom, he requires the transfer. It might require you to suffer and die, he says. But if you want to be my followers, that's what it takes. There's not much sweetness to that gospel, is there? There's a lot of truth, though. And so Jesus calls on Peter, the 12, the crowds, us, to lay down our loyalty to ourselves and offer our loyalty to him and follow. And it's not a one-off thing. It's a practice. The language of taking up your cross here is figurative. Yes, they might actually take up literal crosses, and some of them did. But he expects them to take up their cross today, and what he means is, commit to my way. Follow my pattern. Lend me your loyalty. Be my followers. Not just in this moment, but tomorrow and the next day and the next and the next. He is inviting them to continually practice self-denial and taking up the cross. He is inviting them to continually orient their loyalties to him and his kingdom. John Wesley put it this way on this passage. It is absolutely necessary, Wesley said, in the very nature of the thing, coming after Jesus, discipleship. Absolutely necessary in the very nature of the thing to our coming after him and following him. Insomuch that as we do not practice it, Wesley understands this as practices, insomuch as far as we do not practice it, we are not his disciples. You've realized now that John Wesley was a straight shooter. Called him like he seed him. Got him in trouble a lot. Sometimes people rioted and tried to kill him for shooting straight. But this is him. This is Wesley. And Jesus says what is involved in following him. If we don't do it, we're not his followers. We can say we follow him as much as we want. But if we don't engage in practices that embody following, it's not real, it's not authentic, it's not actual discipleship. Insomuch that as far as we do not practice it, Wesley says, we're not his disciples. He goes on, if we do not continually deny ourselves, that's Jesus' language, we do not learn of him, but of other masters. If we do not take up our cross daily, we do not come after him, but after the world, or after the prince of this world, or after our own fleshly mind. That's a loyalty question, isn't it? Will I come after my own fleshliness, or will I come after Jesus? Discipleship requires the transfer of loyalty from myself to my Lord. From me to Jesus. So what does that look like? When we ask the what does it look like question, we frequently answer it in terms of our individual spirituality. Well, it means that I need to work on my ego or my pride or my dishonesty or my anger. I got all these things interior to me, and I need to work on them. I need to deny myself and take up my cross and offer myself to Jesus. And that's right, and that's good, and those things are there, and we need to talk about those things another day. We often ask this question in relation to our individual walks. We rarely ask this question in relation to the church as a whole. What does it look like for an entire congregation, a church as a whole, a local body of believers, to orient our shared life to embody loyalty to Jesus? What does it mean to say, as a people, we're going to be followers? And how does that impact what happens at our meetings? Whether it's Sunday morning, Wednesday night, or Thursday afternoon, or a Council of Servant Ministries meeting, or any other committee. If we're committed as a group, not just a collection of individuals, but as a people with a shared life, to ordering our shared life to embody loyalty to Jesus, what does that look like? What do we do? How do we behave? What practices are involved? What steps do we take? And that, brothers and sisters, is where worship, connect, serve comes in. When I first got to Christ Church a little over a year ago, it was really, really obvious that several things were really, really important. One of those was Sunday mornings. Worship. 8:15, 10:45, didn't matter which one, it matters. It's important. We show up, we greet one another, we worship together, we offer ourselves to Jesus. Worship is important here. You don't have to be on the property long to discover that. We want Sundays to be excellent, and we want God to be honored. We want people to encounter Him. Whether it's the first time or the 1,000th time, Sunday worship matters. I also noticed that small groups really matter. Whether it's Sunday school in between services, Wednesday night, fall and spring. There's a group that meets on Monday mornings. There are other groups that meet in different places around town. Prayer groups, study groups, Sunday school groups. There's groups all over the place. It was pretty obvious from the start, before day one, this group life really matters here. It's really important. There's a third thing. You've probably already guessed what it is. After all, it's your church. You don't have to be here long to discover that missions matter at Christ Church. Locally, globally, people go serve. We invest in partnerships. We send folks out. Long term, short term, any term, the mission matters. So when we talk about worship, connect, serve, it's not substantively new. The question is, how are those three things related? Does it matter where you start? Is there a progress to be made? And if there is progress, well, what does it look like? What does it entail? And what does it do to me? What kind of person am I becoming? One way to think about the relationship of these three things that have been present at Christ Church for a long, long time, worshiping, connecting in groups, and serving inside the walls and outside the walls. One way to think about those realities that have been here for decades is that some of them require more of us than others of them. We'll start with the thing that requires the least from us. Anybody want to take a shot? Guess what it is? Worship. Worship's crucial, but it doesn't require a lot of self-denial to show up for an hour and a half, one day a week. It's important. It's the first step. But we're not really giving much of ourselves to say of all 7 days of the week, we'll do an hour and a half. We'll be here. That's a bit of a commitment. It's an important commitment. We're not denigrating it. It matters. But of all the things we've talked about, it's the commitment. If Jesus is asking the disciples for an increasing commitment, then we have to say, well, I'm worshiping, but what's the next step? And I've already heard somebody say, well, that group connecting looks like the next step. Why? Well, it takes a little bit more of my week, doesn't it? If I'm going to do a Sunday school, I've either got to show up early if I come to 10:45 or stay late if I go to 8:15. My hour and a half has now become 2.5 to 3 hours. If I want to do Wednesday night and gather with a group, well, I'm going to have to come back on another day. I'm going to have to make my plans. I'm going to have to adjust my schedule. I may have to cancel a meeting or a series of meetings. I've made a commitment to worship. That requires something from me. I'm going to make a further commitment to connecting with a group that will require more of me. And not just time, but energy, focus, attention, attentiveness. Somebody in my group is bound to need me at some point other than our group meeting. They may text me, my kid's going to the hospital. I'll have to show up. I'll have to be there. That's going to take self-denial. It's going to require me to give of myself, to say no to my own loyalties and offer my loyalties to God in Christ and to the people in my group that Jesus has connected me with. If I'm going to commit to a group, that's an increased commitment, isn't it? It's another step. Well, there's only one step left, so that's got to be the further commitment, doesn't it? Serving requires even more. I've got to show up early and rehearse. Or if I'm in the choir, I've got to stay late on Wednesday night when everybody else is going home. Somebody's got to prepare things. Somebody's got to pick up things. If I'm going to serve by leading a group, then Thursday afternoon or Friday morning or Saturday night is not preferable if you're teaching Sunday school, but I know a lot of us do it. Somewhere along the week, I'm going to have to give more of my time and more of my energy. I'm going to have to deny myself and make an increasing commitment to Jesus and His kingdom and the church. So all of a sudden, we've got these things we've been doing all, like for decades, but how do they relate to each other? And do they require us to take steps forward if we think about them as a process? Same stuff, ordered in a certain way. So what is Christ Church about? What do we want people to do? Well, we want you to do 3 things. We want everybody to do 3 things. That's it. We want you to worship. If you're not sick or out of town, show up. That's the commitment we make when we become members of the church. We're going to worship as a baseline, as a minimal thing. We're going to glorify God. We're going to honor Jesus. But if that's all we're doing, well, Jesus invites us to do more. He wants us to connect with a group. After all, that's what He did with His disciples. Sure, they'd go to the temple and worship together, but he would invite them along from Bethsaida to Caesarea Philippi. Small group, 12 guys and Jesus on a road, talking about the kingdom, praying together, going away in the boat, on the mountain, in the wilderness. And he would use that time to equip them and strengthen them. Not just to teach them, but to model for them what a commitment to his kingdom looks like. And it required more of them. A lot of people went to the temple. Not everybody was in the group with Jesus. They have to make an increasing commitment. They have to deny themselves, take up the cross, follow Jesus. 3 things. We want you to worship. We want you to serve, connect in a group. And we want you to serve. Again, Jesus embodies this for us, doesn't he? He takes these guys he's been working with for a while. All right, go preach. Go heal. Go tell people about the kingdom. Get out there and do the work. It's an action reflection model. They go out, they do the work, they come back, he reflects on it, he'll send them out again later. Jesus models a life of worship, connection in group, and serving as a template for the ministry of the church. And those steps will require all of us to say, all right, Jesus, now you've got a little bit more of my heart. Or a lot more. My commitment to you is growing. It's increasing. And so I wonder if I'm thinking in terms of my week, all right, habits, practices that represent loyalty to Jesus and an increasing commitment to him, worshiping, meeting with my group, and serving inside the walls, outside the walls. If I'm doing that, what's it doing to me? And the answer is, it's forming your desires and your loyalties towards Jesus and the church. Think about it this way. Who's tried a new group before? We've all started somewhere. Well, you go to that group, you go for maybe 5 weeks. Then the 5th week rolls along and you're thinking, I could take it or leave it. I'm not sure this is for me. But you decide to give it a few more weeks and a few more weeks. And you go on, and before you know it, you've met with that group for a year. And another year goes by, and you get down to 5 years. Well, at 5 weeks, you could take it or leave it. How does it feel to miss your group after 5 years? You desire to be there. You feel like you're missing a part of yourself. You can't imagine not being with your group after the practice of meeting together and praying together and reading the scriptures together and weeping together and laughing together and showing up together year after year after year, meeting after meeting after meeting, meal after meal after meal. Your life is oriented in that direction, is it not? And so after 5 weeks, yeah, take it or leave it. But 5 years, this is part of my life and my loyalties. So what Jesus is asking the church to do, to transfer our loyalty from self to him, involves the cultivation of practices, basic stuff that's not a reinvention of the wheel. Worshiping, grouping, connecting, and serving. And the more we do that, year in, year out, the more he has us. And the more we have each other. The more our affections and our desires, our loyalties belong to Jesus. You can't deny yourself for a week and tick the box. It's not how discipleship works. Jesus calls his followers to a lifetime of movement. This loyalty I didn't even know I had, aimed at myself. Jesus, you got to turn it to you. Worship, Connect, Serve is a way to do that church-wide. Taking the things that mattered long before I got here and thinking about them as a process. About 400 people worship at Christ Church every week. If only 100 are meeting in a group, how are we doing? Not very good. If only 50 of those are serving somewhere out of the 400, how are we doing? Not very good. We're not just looking at worship attendance. We're looking at how many of us are just moving down the path. How many of us are taking the next step? Do we have 100% of worshipers connecting and serving? And when that happens, as the congregation as a whole is increasingly committed to Jesus, giving him our loyalty, he will do great things through us. For about 15 years now, Christ Church has been committed to certain outcomes. Sending missionaries and planting churches. At least 25 years in the East Lake community. And equipping disciple makers. A discipleship path is an engine that drives the outcome. A discipleship path says, we want people teaching small groups. And that means there's an initial step. You got to worship Jesus. There's another step. You need to be in a group before you lead one. There's another step. You need to serve. And that involves this increasing commitment. And now you're equipped and now you're ready. And we're going to send you to start a new group so that people who haven't been deeply connected can draw near to each other and near to Jesus. We want to send missionaries. But there's a process. If you're going to be a missionary, Jesus has got to have your loyalties. That's a big commitment. Where do we start? Step one, we want worshipers. And then we want people to make another commitment. We want them connecting and growing and being equipped and being strengthened and cultivated. And then we're ready to send you out to serve and commission you, just like Jesus in the 12. We want to support church plants. Christ Church has supported over 700 church plants in the last 15 years. They look different all over the world. Some of them are in India, more house church kind of things. A couple of them are in Kenya. Some of you helped lay the blocks. We haven't had the chance to plant one in Birmingham yet, but the day is coming. Those are the things we're committed to. The question is, how do we cultivate the people who accomplish those things? How do we cultivate the loyalties to Jesus that result in the advancement of the kingdom? Churches planted, missionaries sent, disciple makers made. Locally, globally. My question is that the kind of church we want to continue to be? And if it is, what's the process? So here's the invitation. Take the next step. Whatever it is, whatever it looks like. If you've already connected and worshiping and you're in a group and you're serving, then think of that as a weekly rhythm. Again and again and again for the long haul. And trust Jesus that if you are obedient and you offer yourself to him in faith, I'm going to worship you, Jesus. I'm going to meet with my group. I'm going to serve. Whether it's making the coffee or going on the trip, I'm going to serve. Say no to me and yes to you in an increasing manner. And I trust that you will reproduce your life and character in me. And the mission will go forward. Churches will be planted. Missionaries will be sent. Neighborhoods will be transformed. Christians will make disciples. Would you like to take the next step? Let's pray together. Jesus, you have called all of us to be your followers, your disciples. And you have spoken plainly about what that means and what it looks like. Our desire, oh God, is that you would have our deepest loyalty. And we trust that as we take the next step on the path of following you, Jesus, that you will work in us. You will make us whole. You will uncover those places, hidden places of self-loyalty in our lives. You will carry us forward in our mission to bring the gospel to our neighbors, to the nations, all for whom you have shed your blood. Grant us the grace to be faithful, O God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.